Beyond social facilitation, 100 years of research on social facilitation has made it clear that the mere presence of others is sufficient to increase arousal and thus facilitate performance on well-learned tasks and inhibit performance on novel tasks. It's also clear, however, that people are complex stimuli and that their presence can have a variety of effects that overlay the influence of mere presence that we just examined. People are often very concerned about making a good impression, and their evaluation apprehension can intensify arousal and lead to more pronounced social facilitation effects. One phenomenon that runs counter to the standard social facilitation effects is what social psychologists call social loafing, the tendency to exert less effort when working on a group task in which individual contributions cannot be monitored. If you and your friends have to move a couch up a flight of stairs, for example, you might be tempted to coast a bit and hope that your friends' more vigorous efforts will get the job done. In these situations, people often loaf because their contributions are not seen as crucial to the success of the effort and because their individual contributions, and hence they themselves, can't be assessed. Social loafing, the tendency to exert less effort when working on a group task in which individual contributions cannot be monitored. Social loafing, when their contributions cannot be individually monitored, people have a tendency to loaf, working less hard than they would otherwise and relying on the efforts of others to get the job done. Looking back, even the most minimal group situation, the mere presence of a single other person, can influence performance, as can concerns about being evaluated. The presence of others is arousing, and arousal accentuates a person's existing performance tendencies. Easy tasks are made easier, and difficult tasks are made more difficult. Group decision-making. When people come together in groups, one of the most important things they do is make decisions. Groups that can't decide what to do or how to act don't function well. They wallow, bicker, backstab, and often split apart. You won't be surprised to know, then, that social psychologists have spent considerable energy studying how groups make decisions and what makes those decisions better or worse. Much of the research on group decision-making has been guided by the assumption that decisions made by groups are typically better than decisions made by individuals. The thinking is that many heads are better than one, and indeed, when groups and individuals are presented with problems for which there are precise factual answers, groups are more likely than the average individual to come up with the correct solution. 1986. Yet in many contexts, group decisions are no better than those made by individuals. The key to understanding such contexts is to recognize that although arriving at a best possible solution to a problem may be the group's most important goal, it may not be the most important goal for any of the individual group members. Individuals may be more concerned with how they will be judged by everyone else, how they can avoid hurting someone's feelings, and how they can dodge responsibility if things go wrong. When people get together to make group decisions, some predictable social psychological processes unfold that can undermine the stated goal of arriving at the best possible choice. When people come together, they may surpass, collectively and as a body, the quality of the few best. When there are many who contribute to the process of deliberation, each can bring his share of goodness and moral prudence. Aristotle. Groupthink. In informal settings where social harmony is all important and the costs of making an incorrect decision are not great, it's hardly surprising that group pressure to be agreeable can lead to defective decision-making. But what happens when life and death are literally at stake and the incentives to get it right are high? In these contexts, surely people wouldn't go along with faulty reasoning merely to preserve group harmony or to avoid embarrassment, would they? In fact, they would, and they often do. Irving Janis carefully analyzed a number of decisions made at the very highest levels of the U.S. government and found evidence of just this sort of faulty, and often calamitous, group decision-making. Here are a few of the fiascos Janis studied. The Kennedy administration's decision to foster the overthrow of Fidel Castro's regime by depositing a group of CIA-trained Cuban refugees on the beaches of Cuba's Bay of Pigs, but failing to provide air cover. The refugees were captured in short order, thus humiliating the United States internationally, both for its role in trying to undermine a sovereign nation and for initially denying its involvement in the affair. The Johnson administration's decision to increase the number of American soldiers fighting in Vietnam. This policy failed to advance U.S. objectives in the region and substantially increased the number of lives lost. The conclusion by the U.S. Naval High Command that extra precautions were not needed at Pearl Harbor, despite warnings of an imminent attack by the Japanese. This had severe repercussions on December 7, 1941, the Day of Infamy, when the Japanese destroyed a large part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in a surprise attack. Janus attributed these disastrous decisions to groupthink, a kind of faulty thinking by highly cohesive groups in which the critical scrutiny that should be devoted to the issues at hand is subverted by social pressures to reach consensus. Other investigators have made the same claim about more recent disasters, such as the ill-fated launches of the space shuttles Challenger and Columbia, and other consequential government decisions. Groupthink, faulty thinking by members of highly cohesive groups in which the critical scrutiny that should be devoted to the issues at hand is subverted by social pressures to reach consensus. Symptoms and sources of groupthink. According to Janus, groupthink is the compromised decision-making of a group, fueled by a shallow examination of information, a narrow consideration of alternatives, and a sense of invulnerability or moral superiority, 1972. Especially under the direction of a strong leader, groups may discourage others from coming forward with dissenting ideas and assessments, ignore or reject alternative viewpoints, and end up overly confident about the wisdom and moral correctness of their proposed solutions. Thus, the very source of a group's potentially superior decision-making, the airing of differing opinions and the presentations of varied facts and perspectives, never comes into play. Figure 12.4. The historical record shows that social psychological forces have had a hand in numerous instances of faulty decision-making. Less clear, however, is whether these psychological processes cluster together to produce a recognizable condition of groupthink. Do such conditions as cohesiveness, insularity, and high stress tend to occur together, or are they separate variables that each might lead to groupthink in separate ways? And are symptoms of groupthink essential ingredients of this sort of faulty decision-making? Questions like these have not been adequately resolved, and the evidence gathered to test Janus's thesis has been mixed. Nonetheless, his observations have been useful in identifying social factors that can lead to calamitous decisions, as well as factors that can improve group decision-making. For example, strong, directive leaders who make their preferences known sometimes intimidate even the most accomplished group members and stifle vigorous discussion. Also, just as Janus contends, at times the issue that must be decided is so stressful that groups seek the reassurance and comfort of premature or illusory consensus. In addition, both strong leaders and the drive to find consensus breed self-censorship, the decision to withhold information or opinions. Janus reports that Arthur Schlesinger, a member of President Kennedy's inner circle during the Bay of Pigs deliberations, was ever afterward haunted for having kept so silent during those crucial discussions in the cabinet room. I can only explain my failure to do more than raise a few timid questions by reporting that one's impulse to blow the whistle on this nonsense was simply undone by the circumstances of the discussion. Self-censorship, withholding information or opinions in group discussions. Some of the participants in that fiasco have written that the pressures to agree with the flawed plan were so great because the group was newly created, and the participants were reluctant to step on each other's toes. In contrast, by the time that same group came together to deliberate over subsequent crises, they had been around the block with one another and were more willing to offer and accept criticism without worrying so much about threatening their relationship with the group. Figure 12.4. Elements of Janus's groupthink hypothesis. Certain conditions lead decision-making groups to be excessively concerned with seeking consensus, which detracts from a full, rational analysis of the existing problem. Antecedent conditions: high cohesiveness, insulation of the group, lack of procedures for information search and appraisal, directive leadership, high stress with a low degree of hope for finding a better solution than the one favored by the leader or other influential people. Goes to motivation, concurrent seeking. Goes to symptoms of groupthink, illusion of invulnerability, collective rationalization, belief in an inherent morality of the group, stereotypes of outgroups, direct pressure on dissenters, self-censorship, illusion of unanimity, symptoms of defective decision-making, incomplete survey of objectives, incomplete survey of alternatives, poor information search, failure to examine risks of preferred choice, selective bias in processing information at hand, failure to reappraise alternatives, failure to work out contingency plans. Preventing groupthink. In light of the perils of groupthink, Janice offers several ideas for improving group deliberations. Freer, more vigorous discussion is likely to take place, for example, if group leaders refrain from making their opinions or preferences known at the beginning. Groups can also avoid the tunnel vision and illusion of consensus by making sure the group isn't cut off from outside input. People who weren't part of the early stages of a discussion can provide a fresh perspective and also put the brakes on any rash actions that might otherwise develop. Finally, a similar safeguard against rash action and unsound argumentation is to designate one person in the group to play devil's advocate, to be given every incentive to name any and all weaknesses in the group's proposed plan of action. In addition to his analysis of foreign policy fiascos, Janice also examined a number of highly successful decisions, including the Kennedy administration's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and claimed that the deliberations leading to these successful decisions were not marked by symptoms of groupthink. Janice noted how President Kennedy and his advisors, embarrassed by the Bay of Pigs disaster, took steps to ensure that all future policies would be evaluated more thoroughly from then on. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the president frequently excused himself from the group so as not to constrain the discussion. He also brought in outside experts to critique his advisors' analysis and tentative plans, and he appointed specific individuals, his brother Robert Kennedy and Theodore Sorensen, to act as devil's advocates. See box 12.1 for other behaviors that make for smarter group decision-making. These safeguards seem to have paid off because the negotiations that kept Soviet missiles out of Cuba were one of the enduring highlights of the tragically short Kennedy administration. Preventing groupthink. John F. Kennedy's cabinet met during the Cuban Missile Crisis to try to resolve the impasse with the Soviets over Soviet missiles in Cuba. They took steps to avoid groupthink by encouraging vigorous debate and making recommendations based on unbiased analysis. Group polarization. Today's headlines of acrimonious elections, gridlock in Congress, the culture wars over immigration and abortion, and protests on college campuses suggest that we are living in a time of profound discord. Might basic group processes have something to do with the social divisions we are experiencing? One contributor to such social divisions is group polarization, whereby group decisions tend to be more extreme than those made by individuals. Whatever way the majority of the individuals are leaning, group discussion tends to make them lean even further in that direction. In one study, for example, French students expressed their opinions about President Charles de Gaulle, a French general during World War II, and about Americans, first individually and then again after having discussed them in groups. The results? Their initially positive sentiments toward de Gaulle became even more positive, and their initially negative sentiments toward Americans became even more negative. 1969. It appears that we are more likely to hear ugly American from a group of foreigners than from a collection of individual foreigners. Group polarization. The tendency for group decisions to be more extreme than those made by individuals. Whatever way the group as a whole is leaning, group discussion tends to make it lean further in that direction. It's agreed, then, that we move forward on the philodendron. It's a comic and some people are putting their hands up to vote. It's like people in a board meeting. Why does group discussion lead to more extreme positions by group members? Why is it that individuals in a group don't simply conform to the group average, instead of moving the group in one direction or the other? Research indicates that two causes work in concert to produce group polarization. One involves the persuasiveness of the information brought up during group discussion. The other involves people's tendency to try to claim the right position among the various opinions within the group. Let's consider each explanation in turn. Focus on social determinants of collective intelligence. The study of groupthink is largely a story about the poor decisions groups are vulnerable to in certain conditions. The literature begs the question, what group processes make for smarter decision-making? Anita Woolley and Thomas Malone have been seeking answers to this very question. In one early study in this research program, small groups of students engaged in a variety of well-tested decision-making tasks. 2010, the groups of participants reasoned through practical intelligence tasks, such as identifying what 5 things a person would need to survive alone in the desert. They tackled tasks requiring logical reasoning. They engaged in open-ended brainstorming. Each group's scores on these tasks were tallied to yield a score of the group's collective intelligence. What dynamics raised a group's collective intelligence? One hypothesis might be that it just takes one really smart person to lift the intelligence of a group's decision-making. This proved not to be the case. How well each individual did on decision-making tasks prior to the study had no influence on the collective intelligence of that person's group. Instead, groups that had more empathic individuals, as assessed in an emotion recognition task prior to the study, had higher collective intelligence scores. Also, groups that practiced effective turn-taking as they deliberated, where each member had the chance to voice ideas freely, scored higher in their collective intelligence. Groups led by one domineering person prone to monologues and decrees proved to be less intelligent. And finally, as the proportion of women in the group rose, so too did the team's collective intelligence, presumably because women are more likely to engage in social behaviors, empathic listening, effective turn-taking, more open-ended discussion, that promote collective intelligence. Why does group discussion lead to more extreme positions by group members? Let's consider each explanation in turn. The persuasive arguments account. When trying to decide on a course of action, people consider the merit of different arguments. It stands to reason that when people are predisposed to favor one course of action in a given situation, they can think of more and better arguments for that action. Of course, any one person in the group is unlikely to think of all the arguments in favor of one alternative or the other. So, when the issue is discussed by the group, each person is likely to be exposed to new arguments. This expanded pool of arguments, in turn, is likely to be skewed in favor of the action the people were predisposed to. The net result, then, is that group discussions tend to expose the average person to even more arguments in favor of the position that the average person was already inclined to take. This exposure serves to strengthen those initial inclinations, and group polarization happens. This explanation suggests that personal, face-to-face discussion is not necessary to produce group polarization. All that's needed is exposure to the pool of arguments that true group discussion tends to elicit. Several studies have tested this idea by having participants read the arguments of other group members in private, so that they are exposed to the arguments without knowing who in the group might have advanced them. In support of the persuasive argument's interpretation, these studies have shown that reading others' arguments is indeed sufficient to produce group polarization. The social comparison interpretation. Another process that encourages group polarization is the very human tendency to compare ourselves with others. Am I as smart as most people here? Do my neighbors all drive better cars than I do? Am I getting as much out of life as everyone else? Consider how these sorts of comparisons might lead to group polarization. For example, when evaluating an issue for which people are inclined to take risks, for example, a career choice early in life, people are likely to think they're more tolerant of risk than the average person. In this case, riskiness is valued, and people like to think of themselves as having more than an average amount of a valued trait. On the other hand, when considering an issue for which people are inclined to be cautious, investing money that belongs to a beloved relative, most people are likely to think that they are more prudent or risk-averse than the average person. People tend to think, in other words, that they are farther out on the correct side of the opinion distribution on most issues. What happens when everyone in a group is inclined to make the same choice, say a risky choice, and are also inclined to think of themselves as more likely than average to take risks? Many people will inevitably find that their tolerance of risk is closer to average than they thought, perhaps even below average. This realization leads some individuals to attempt to show that they are in fact more risk-tolerant than average. The group as a whole, then, becomes a bit riskier on those issues for which a somewhat risky approach initially seemed warranted. Similarly, the group would become a bit more conservative on those issues for which a somewhat cautious approach seemed warranted. In other words, the desire to distinguish oneself from others by expressing a more extreme opinion in the right direction leads predictably to the group polarization effect. As one journalist put it, people are always trying to outdo one another. If everyone in a group agrees that men are jerks, then someone in the group is bound to argue that they're assholes. 2009. Risk takers. The value placed on risk-taking is reflected in the widespread admiration of bold entrepreneurs who took big chances and ended up reshaping entire industries. Vera Wang altered the landscape of bridal fashion, and Steve Jobs transformed the world of computers, music, and communications. The social comparison interpretation can be tested by doing just the opposite of what was done to test the persuasive arguments account. Expose people to everyone else's positions without conveying the content of any of the arguments for or against one position or another. As predicted, in one experiment when people were told only about others' positions and not provided any arguments or reasons underlying those positions, the group polarization effect was observed. But the group polarization effect in this experiment was weaker than usual, as would be expected if both persuasive arguments and social comparison contribute to the effect. The dangers of groupthink. Post-mortem analyses of the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 identified examples of apparent groupthink on the part of those responsible for the decision. So it's showing a destroyed building in Iraq. A closer look, taking it to extremes, politics and group polarization. Group polarization, the tendency for group members to embrace more extreme positions after discussing an issue, can be intensified when the group consists largely of like-minded individuals. Such was the focus of a 2007 study on conservative versus liberal political views in the United States. The results showed clear-cut group polarization. After deliberating with ideologically similar others, liberals became even more liberal, and conservatives became even more conservative. Moreover, the political beliefs within each group became increasingly similar. Polarization on hot-button issues. In this study, residents of relatively liberal Boulder, Colorado, and relatively conservative Colorado Springs had 15-minute discussions about climate change, affirmative action, and same-sex civil unions with people from their own community. Before and after the discussions, participants rated their views on the topics on a 1 to 10 scale. The graph shows participants' average ratings for the three topics. Overall polarization among groups. So the first scale is measuring Boulder liberal, and the scale is 10 is most liberal to 1 is most conservative. So before the discussion, people were 8.07 liberal, and after the discussion, people are 8.50 liberal, out of 10 being the most liberal. So their liberality has increased by about 0.45 on a scale of 1 to 10. The second scale measures Colorado Springs, which was initially conservative. 10 is still most liberal, and 1 is most conservative. So before the discussion, people were 3.48, and after the discussion, they were 2.26. So they became actually about 0.8 more conservative. Polarization of U.S. political views. Group polarization has broader implications for the political climate as people seek out homogeneous social environments. They are increasingly exposed only to views that resemble their own, which pushes their views further toward the extremes. In 2004, 70% of Republicans were more conservative than the median Democrat, and 68% of Democrats were more liberal than the median Republican. In 2014, 92% of Republicans were more conservative than the median Democrat, and 94% of Democrats were more liberal than the median Republican. So this shows a dangerous trend toward group polarization in politics, where Democrats and Republicans are having less and less common ground and more extreme views, probably due to echo chambers. Leadership and power. Social hierarchies are a natural part of group life. So are leaders and people who are led. When children as young as 2 join their first groups, their packs of friends in preschool, some quickly rise to the top rungs of status. When middle school children form groups of friends at summer camp, they quickly identify the leaders and those who are more likely to follow. 1977. Even in the egalitarian confines of a college dorm, hallmates within the first week of living together agree on who are the floor leaders and who are not. 2001. Groups quickly evolve into hierarchies because having leaders helps solve some of the problems inherent in group living. The allocation of resources can give rise to intense conflict between group members, and a social hierarchy provides rules for dividing up resources that, although often unfair, those on top get more, can dampen or avoid that strife. Group decision-making can sometimes be unmanageably complex, and hierarchies provide a shared notion of who guides group discussion and how decisions are made. The collective actions in which groups engage demand that individual behaviors be coordinated, and having leaders helps get the group going and provides needed order. Finally, group life often requires that individuals sacrifice their own interests to benefit the group, and leaders, especially charismatic leaders, can help motivate selfless action. That leaders and hierarchies are an inevitable part of group life leads us to 2 important questions: who rises to positions of leadership, and what happens to leaders once they're in positions of power? Characteristics of leaders. How do people rise to positions of leadership in social hierarchies? The influential Italian philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli offers his hypotheses in The Prince, the most influential book ever written on the nature of leadership. His thesis, formulated amid the turmoil of 16th century, 1500s Italy, is that people rise to positions of leadership by being deceptive, by pitting competitors against one another, and by coercion, fear, and manipulation, rather than directness, honesty, and inspiration. This strategy can be effective in short-term encounters. For example, if you have to negotiate a single deal, 2002, but on balance, studies find that people who adhere to the Machiavellian philosophy of power actually report feeling less powerful in their work and personal lives than other people. Actually, one of the most important determinants of leadership is skillful expertise relevant to the goals of the group. There is simply no substitute for having specific talents that enable the group to achieve its goals. The emergency room nurse, who has the most adroit and timely skills in surgery, will rise in the ranks at that hospital. The software engineer who knows how to write the best code will rise in today's tech world. Cameron Anderson and Galvin Kilduff have found that groups tend to choose quickly as leaders those individuals who demonstrate knowledge and skill in tasks that are central to the group's identity and goals. When leaders have the knowledge and skill that enable better group performance, everyone benefits.